Good evening. My name is MORITZ. I'm the director of the Austrian Study Centre for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight for this discussion on Afghanistan, teaching peace with an empire. We are very happy to do this in cooperation with the International Institute for Peace here at the event hall of the Institute. Of course, here in Europe, we find ourselves currently in very complicated and difficult circumstances where our very understanding of what peaceful coexistence, cooperative security, and such like concepts might mean. So many irreversible steps have been taken that European security has become a zero-sum game. So, in one way or another, these very dramatic, drastic, tragic events seem to have overtaken us very often and seem to have turned our view away from other theaters that are no less tragic and dramatic. In my mind, it seems almost decades ago when last August events overtook themselves in this most dramatic and tragic fashion in Afghanistan. And of course, what happened since then, all the developments that we have witnessed and that are now overshadowed by what's happening in Europe, at least in our perception, are no less dramatic. So we see worlds crumbling, life plans crushed, hopes destroyed for so many people in Afghanistan that were hoping for what also we in the West had promised them in terms of building something that resembles a place where personal freedoms can be lived, where your voice is heard, where there's some sort of democracy, human rights. Now we know that the exact opposite, or the direction is going in the exact opposite. So, yeah, this leaves us with the very difficult question, which I'm very glad I don't have to answer. What does peace mean in such a context? Peace with whom? And peace for what aim? I think there's few contexts where this is more difficult to answer. Now let me hand over the mic to Mrs. Stephanie FENKART, the director of the International Institute for Peace, who will further moderate the discussion.
Thank you very much, Moritz, for your welcoming remarks, and thanks a lot for the cooperation. This is a cooperation between the International Institute for Peace and the Austrian Study Centre for Peace and Conflict Resolution. And I think especially in these times it is very important that our institutions who are dealing with peace and not only with war do cooperate in a sense, because I have very often the feeling that it becomes increasingly more difficult even to talk about peace. And this is of course also true because of what just recently happened in Ukraine, the invasion, the Russian invasion, the unprovoked invasion. But we cannot and we should never forget also about other issues which are still at stake, and Afghanistan is one of those very, very big issues which has been, I would say, in the news for 40 years right now. I mean, starting from when the Soviets tried to occupy it, they failed, and in the end, it gives you a feeling that everyone loses when it comes to Afghanistan. I would very much like to welcome our special guest today, who is Victoria FONTAN. And she is a professor of peace and conflict studies and vice president of academic affairs at the American University of Afghanistan. She is also a visiting professor at the Western Institute of Technology and Higher Education in Guadalajara, Mexico. And your academic specialization is twofold, I read before, and it has been dealing with critical terrorism studies from a peace studies perspective, and second, with a post-liberal peace studies from a decolonial perspective. And this already leads me back to the title, which I find very interesting because it says, Teaching Peace with an Empire. And for me, normally when I think about empires, I mean, as an Austrian, of course, I think of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, then we would think about Great Britain and their imperial state, and about the Ottoman Empire. So I look forward to your explanation, what you will develop on that one. And then reflections on decolonial peace from post-Naqba Afghanistan. And this is also very interesting because I remember when we have been discussing of doing an event together also with some of my colleagues, it was like, but Naqba, that's for the Palestinians, because it is a translation of the big catastrophe in 48. So I think it does probably reflect also what is happening in Afghanistan since decades. So I'm very, very happy that you managed to come here. It's the third try, I think. We needed to postpone twice already due to the COVID situation. I also would like to welcome our online guests because as still people are not really that used to go out and to meet in public, so we try also to have it online, so it is live streamed on our YouTube channel and on Facebook as well, and people are free to ask questions. My colleague will check them online and will post them for you. And I would like to give you the mic for the next 20-25 minutes, explaining us a little bit, what does peace mean in Afghanistan? Is there something like peace, people working for peace? I mean, we know nation building has been a very, very big, important topic when it comes to the occupation, which was for more than 20 years now for mostly the Americans, partly with NATO. And in the end, after they left, I mean, we see right now, which is very concerning, that the Taliban did not change a lot, it seems. I mean, we just recently had the very disturbing notice that females again need to wear the burqa, which is a total segregation from public life for half of a population. It's very difficult to understand. And also then the hope that we had, like that at least in these 20 years when so much money was spent, where was it spent for? What was it spent for? Was it also probably included in people who try to transform society from their levels, not like having this colonial idea of nation building in the sense of that European nations would have been building their nations and nation states with homogeneous societies, more or less homogeneous societies. The floor is yours for the next, I would say, 30 minutes. We do have around an hour 15, 20, depending on how many questions are coming in. And I would very much like also to ask you if you have questions. I mean, we have an expert here, and use the opportunity and ask her whatever you like, and she chooses what she's able to answer. Thanks for coming, and thanks again for the cooperation, MORITZ, and welcome to all of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me today and for including Afghanistan in your talks for peace, knowing that being based in Europe at the moment, there are many more maybe some more pressing issues, but at the same time, I think it's still important to reflect on peace and the types of peace that we are seeking to see evolving in different parts of the world. And when I talk about decolonial peace, I hope that some of it is going to, let's say, resonate with some of the debates that you're having here in Austria and in Europe. So I have a few questions to start this presentation with, and also a few pictures. Why did I call this presentation, why did I include Naqba in this presentation? Because for us, at the American University of Afghanistan, August 15th was our Naqba. It was our catastrophe. It was the end, it was the abrupt end of 20 years of liberal peace, where the international community thought it was making rapid advances towards shaping Afghanistan in a way that was to resemble many other post-conflict scenarios and societies across the world. And for us, I'm going to keep talking about this liberal peace and our university at the same time, because our university is the last remaining legacy of the US presence in Afghanistan today. We are still financed by US aid, and we, from many perspectives, we are the only thing that's left. We are still operating online. We took an intake of 70 students back in January, 75% of which women, and we are expecting another 120 students next September. So as we went through the abrupt end in August 2021, we asked ourselves some very important questions. How did we come to this? A week before the end that nobody saw coming, even the Taliban, on August 15th, in the evening of August 15th, the Mullah Baradar, who was one of the negotiators of the peace process in Doha, issued a statement saying, you know, we didn't expect this to happen. It happened very fast. God helped us. Okay, now we have to do, you know, now we're in business and we have to do something. And so for from all the different perspectives, this was an unexpected scenario. For us, a week before the fall of Kabul, we were scrutinized by our Ministry of Higher Education upon a specific request from the president of Afghanistan himself, because he wanted his, you know, at the height of the conflict in early August, his main concern was to rank different private universities. So the war was going on, was raging all over the country. Towns were falling one after the other, and his only care in the world was to send us a team to rank us, to make sure that we were, you know, up to the standards that he, as an academic himself, had set for academic life in Afghanistan. And as the review was going, it was a grueling accreditation process. As the review was happening, all the review teams sent by the ministry was asking us tickets to the US to evacuate them. They knew already what was happening. Nobody knew how fast it would go, but they were all asking to go. And that was the main question that we started to ask ourselves at the university. Who's going to be there to fight? And who's going to be there to fight for, you know, maybe not with weapons, but fight for the democratic and the personal freedoms that they had been developing for the past 20 years. So, of course, our main concern was, at the time, and as a peace study scholar, okay, liberal peace never disappoints, and it always fails. And once again, did it fail? A few months down the line now, it's been 8 to 9 months. It's very difficult to talk about peace in Afghanistan. It's the country and the community is so polarized in different parts of the world and also within Afghanistan, than to talk about peace is what is now called whitewashing. Nobody really knows what it means, but from the perspective of the antagonism that we see towards peace, it's basically appeasement. So now talking about peace means appeasement, and therefore can no longer be uttered in public spaces. We see it on Twitter, we see it in different parts of Afghanistan. We have now more pressing concerns, there's a humanitarian crisis, etc. And that's basically where we are right now. So after we asked ourselves those questions, so to go back to the university, our university, it was established in 2006 as a liberal arts institution. We had partnerships all over the world, and the 4 programs that we still have, business, law, information technology, and political science and public administration, were basically geared towards educating the future leaders of Afghanistan to almost create a country as if you were building a machine. So, and that's really the definition of liberal peace, to create a country and certain institutions to build a nation that is going to create a market of consumers who are going to then feed a thriving economy and a thriving growth. So for the last 20 years, the mission of the university has been to feed an army of bureaucrats, politicians, and civil society actors to really build this liberal peace ideal and mission. But then in 2016, an attack from the Taliban came out of nowhere. There was really this thinking within the university that because we were an education mission, we would never be targeted. And then back in 2016, in the month of August, the Taliban attacked us, killed 15 students and faculty members. 2 weeks before, they had abducted 2 faculty members who were in the hands of the Taliban for 3.5 years. And basically, overnight, we became involved and implicated in this conflict. And why? Because we were seen by the Taliban as this arm of liberal peace. And I think that what's really important for us is that, we reopened, but we reopened within a certain, within a different approach. We became a maximum security prison. We were surrounded by walls from 2016 until last summer. We had 9 ballistic towers with an army of 300 Gurkhas staying on campus and basically defending us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with a budget of approximately $500,000 per month. Okay, so that was basically thanks to this deployment of forces that we were able to teach peace and conflict studies. And that's really interesting because from a peace studies perspective, when you reach that level, you have to ask yourself, specifically as a scholar, is it really worth it? Is it really worth it to almost to deploy such means to talk about critical thinking, to talk about gender studies, to talk about inclusion, diversity, and all the values that go around peace and conflict studies? And so we almost, we created an island of freedom within Kabul where students were able to discover their academic interests. They discovered one another because Afghanistan is such a polarized society between different ethnic groups that never really got the chance to interact with one another, even in those for the past 40 years of the conflict. Within our campus, they were able to study together, ask each other really tough questions, and sometimes, vote for one another in our student government association elections, which they wouldn't do in other elections that were taking place outside of our walls. And so also an interesting image that you see here is a miniature from the 15th century, the School of Herat, where you see men and women studying together in the courtyard of a mosque with a woman that you can see in red over there, being in the axe of the sacred dome, meaning that a woman is the representation, the incarnation of God. And so it's a really important Sufi image that shows that back in the 15th century, men and women could study together, and it was okay to represent faces. And all those dogmas that we think about today when we think about Islam are not the culture of Afghanistan that you can see here. So today, this covering of women's faces, this certain political expression of a certain type of Islam has nothing to do with the culture of Afghanistan, and I think that it's really important to understand. And we had 150 of those miniatures on our walls at the university, protected again by this liberal peace concept. And here you have an image of our armed guards who stayed behind. So when we talk about liberal arts, we asked ourselves, we are the expression of liberal peace, but at the same time, we try to go further. We try to, again, promote critical thinking, promote those democratic and those personal freedom values that you talked about earlier, open Afghanistan to the rest of the world into a global awareness that we hoped would create certain circles of discussions that would go beyond some of the ethnic discussions, peace discussions that were taking place between the different groups during the past 20 years. All the different groups and their different political leaders were more interested during those 20 years, more interested in talks of amnesty, talks of different power-sharing agreements, talks of different seats within parliament, etc., more than really recreating a social fabric that we try to recreate within our initiative, and really try to expand on the different forms of knowledge that existed within Afghanistan, which is why we were not necessarily focusing only on the topics that we were teaching, but everything, we were trying to prepare our students for the Afghanistan that they wanted to see and give them the courage and the hope. You talked about hope earlier, the hope that they had the possibility to create their own country. And then on August 15th, of course, we had the perfect storm. What happened is that, as usual with liberal peace, trying to build a country artificially when at the same time a savage war is going on, and when all the different parties to the conflict are perpetrators of violence, it cannot work. And that's what gives peace such a difficult name eventually. So to give you an idea, in 2019, in the first half of 2019, government and NATO forces made more civilian casualties than the Taliban. Then the second half of 2019, it was the Taliban that superseded those NATO/Afghan government numbers. So we had a peace bubble. The first circle of that peace bubble was us in Kabul. We were right next to the Darul Aman Palace, beautiful setting. And then we had, Kabul was a bubble in itself. There were so many talks and so many roundtables and so many events talking about peace and the types of peace we wanted to see. And is this peace really inclusive? We need to include women. We need to include this, that, and the other. But eventually, those were many talks with lots of foreign representatives and lots of what we call the Kabul elite. But the rest of the country was suffering airstrikes, arrests, and all sorts of human rights violations that, of course, created a ground for the Taliban to rapidly advance in the different parts, of the country and throughout the years. So eventually, that peace that was artificially created in some parts of the country became more and more retrenched by, let's say, the other side of the coin, which was this political and this military violence that was taking place and fueled by NATO. So as the country, as that peace collapsed, and we believed in it up until the last moment. So to go back to the perfect storm, what happened was, first of all, there was this violence, and then there was a political elite in Afghanistan that saw the disaster coming, but somehow didn't manage to find an agreement before it was too late. And that was, I mean, up until June, former President Karzai, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, I mean, all the different political figures who had marked Afghanistan since the past, 40 years, got together and said, okay, we'd better create a coalition government because this is not going to end well. Who said no? It was the president of Afghanistan and his staff who tried to keep on and latch on to power until the very last moment. Then on August 12th, what happened? They basically left the country. And that's when we realized, no, on August 12th, the New York Times office departed, and we thought, okay, when the New York Times goes, this is not a good sign, so we decided to go at the same time. The French embassy called me and said, we've got to go. And the next day, President Ghani left, and then everything crumbled almost overnight. And so it was a perfect storm because everybody was ready to go. The government was gone. The international community was folding very quickly. And we realized that there were so many Afghanistans within one, but that somehow there was not that one Afghan state entity that people could identify with, and that the army also defending Afghanistan could not identify with. And so this was really, and to many observers' eyes, it was like a deck of cards that completely, a card castle that completely vanished overnight. And the exile was extremely rapid. We had maybe 6 to 8 hours to gather all the files that we had on campus, and we tried to burn them before we left, so as not to leave any records of our students, of our faculty, to the hands of the Taliban. And of course we didn't have enough time, and I took that picture at the same time as looking for one of the campus cats 5 minutes before we left, and that was it. And I didn't find the cat, and I didn't finish burning the file. So that's a picture in our plane. We left on August 21st. We were the last one of the last few internationals to leave. We had been we were held by the Taliban for 4 days before we managed to leave. Then in the aftermath, of course, for the student population, we had many students left behind, and those are some of the testimonies. We still have 370 students in Afghanistan. We have staff, we have professors, and our main job right now is to have them keep hope. And it's very difficult because we can teach online, but at the same time, now, of course, since the Taliban are finding it difficult to govern, are finding it difficult to, run the country and provide services for the population, there's no electricity. So just before I came today, we had a meeting talking about how are we going to wrap up the semester. And we realized that there's no electricity. Our students are able to go to internet cafes, but only male students. And so the female students, of course, since now they cannot go out, they are disadvantaged for their final exams and they don't know how they're going to manage. This is the type of reality we are dealing with right now. And so after the Naqba, our main aim was to keep on teaching for the sake of those students left behind, because if we go, then what happens? So as we reorganized, we decided to keep operating within Afghanistan with the help of our partners from the Open Society University Network. We evacuated relocated students to Kyrgyzstan, to Iraq, and other parts of the world. And what we are trying to do right now is to work one day at a time, one community at a time, to provide support and to keep a space for dialogue on peace outside of Afghanistan for our community within Afghanistan. And it's very difficult because we are grappling with this ourselves on a daily level. We were victim to the conflict back in 2016. We don't believe now that our community is directly threatened, but at the same time, with everything that's happening on a daily basis, some days we have more hope than others, and there are some days much, much harder than others also for our faculty. And the main question that we're asking ourselves is, should we ever stop talking within ourselves about peace, and also with the different interlocutors in Afghanistan? For the longest time, because of the fact that we are funded by USAID, we were unable to talk to the Taliban because of what we call the OFAC rules, which is the Office of Sanctions and the federal, because we are a recipient of federal funds. And so now we have been cleared to talk with the government, but of course, this is not happening at my level, and we're still asking ourselves in what way to engage a government that clearly is not working alongside the same values that we hold, and that's extremely difficult. And I have those two pictures here because those are the Taliban captors that were, they were just handling me and my colleagues before, and I took, they were taking videos of us for YouTube, and then I decided to take selfies. I've got one, but I don't like, selfies sound really cheap, so I didn't, but I took pictures of them as well, and they were really kind to us in the end, and that after 4 days of feeling captive and being held captive, and then I thought, okay, we, on an individual level, we definitely, we can always talk and we can always relate to one another. And after being so scared for those days, interacting with them like that, to me, and I know it can sound very naive, but to me it was extremely important because it reminded me that we and I know it's, we call it lieu commun in French. I know it's something really common to say, but we really are all human beings, and that was one of the most important moments of that particular process that we went through, and one of those youngsters talked to the other. They were together, and one of them says to his friend in Pashto, he says, "Oh, talking about me, I think she likes me. Do you think she'll take me to the US with her?" And so, when the Taliban say that, you always have a way into their hearts somehow. And that was really interesting to me and important. So right now, talking about peace is very difficult in Afghanistan because of the humanitarian disaster, the food shortages, the different, the inability, the food insecurity, the inability for many parts of the population to have access to basic services, and also the inequalities that are happening within the population. So and that are suffered by the population. So what happens is that we also, as a peace community, have been hijacked by this humanitarian imperative. And peace almost becomes redundant, because why should we talk about peace when people are starving? And we don't understand that everything should be articulated together. Some of the initiatives that are taking place, spearheaded by our students, some of them are students and faculty, some of them still in Afghanistan, some outside of Afghanistan, are trying to change that and change that narrative, and are trying to articulate the humanitarian effort with peace talks and with keeping this dialogue alive. And this is happening right now in small pockets within different parts of Afghanistan. Some of those initiatives are trying to now become more concerted between one another. So we are starting to see, after so many months, the rebirth of some locally grown and managed peace networks that are now focusing both on humanitarian assistance and food security, while at the same time working on reminding people of their own agency and the possibility of them to have a voice within a very small civil society type of environment. This environment right now, at the moment, is being held being held by the pressure that the international community is trying to leverage, not against the Taliban, but with the Taliban. The European Union has been very active in reminding the Taliban of some of the promises that they made when they arrived in power. And that sphere is extremely important, because as it is concerting with those locally grown initiatives, it is almost becoming their safety net. And it's really important that this very weak link is not broken, because if it is, and if the Taliban see that they have absolutely no chance at gaining international recognition, this is going to completely close the country and let's say emphasize the role of other international actors that have other interests in Afghanistan, and this is mainly the Chinese. The Chinese right now are in Bagram Air Base. They're holding, they basically reinvested Bagram Air Base. They are starting to mine the natural resources of Afghanistan. There's copper mines, there's all sorts of, it's an incredibly rich country in terms of natural resources. And if the country completely closes itself from the rest of the world, the Chinese have absolutely no problem with extracting those resources, and are certainly not going to talk about human rights as they enrich themselves. And that is, of course, going to isolate the population even more. And I think that it's a really difficult balance to have between, keep talking to the Taliban, about the Taliban and with the Taliban, while at the same time we know that the Taliban are doing the same thing as they did when they held us hostage. They take us, and then they basically decide on what terms they're going to release us. The same is happening right now with the population. So should one ever talk with under that sort of pressure, I would say that yes, because the people who are, when an entire population is taken hostage, I think it's worth it. Some days we're talking about resistance. Some days we are so, we have lost all the hope in peace that exists, and other days we're like, no, we have to keep believing in our core principle of nonviolence. And here comes, in this articulation between this humanitarian imperative that we have and the peace discussion, there is something that I haven't seen within our peace and studies field yet. And it's something that I discovered when I was working in the humanitarian sector, the core humanitarian principles of humanity, independence, neutrality, and I always forget one of the four. We should have those for peace and conflict studies, and we don't have them. And as we engage with populations, I think that it's really important for us to remember that, and this goes back to, teaching peace with guns. Well, should we actually do that? I'm not so sure. But yet, we did it for so many years, and at the end, did it really change anything or not? I don't know. Some days I say yes, some days I don't. So when we talk about decolonial peace, I think that first we have to ask ourselves, what are the principles, what are the core principles of this decolonial peace that we're talking about? And for me, decolonial peace is everything that happens outside of the budget lines that we see on our Excel sheets on a daily level. So, I have X amount of students, X amount of faculty, and, where is the community that is built in those interactions? You cannot quantify a community, and yet if we had this sense of community, this sense of an Afghan state and of an Afghan nation, maybe not everybody would have rushed to take airplanes and would have stayed and tried to, and kept hope for Afghanistan. For me, taking a plane out meant, and that's why I left it to the last minute and maybe a little too late, but not taking that plane meant, and even coming back after everybody had taken the first plane, was in essence not giving up on creating and contributing towards a society that was inclusive and diverse. And so as we continue this Afghan journey, I think it's really important to create a space for Afghans to decide on the Afghanistans that they want to see. But it's very difficult to decide what you want to see as a society if you feel you have no agency and you are in fear. So which type of community can be built? Can a peace community be established? If you go on Twitter today, the dialogues, there's zero dialogues on Afghanistan anymore. People are killing each other with bullets, death by Twitter on a daily basis. There is zero communication, zero dialogue on Afghanistan. It's about people really harming one another with words. So there needs to be a critical mass of that hope that let's say that establishes itself outside those individual boundaries into a community of practice towards peace. There needs to be a common voice that is found, and also for us to remember what what the universal values of peace are. And there's a long way to go, but for me, agency and an organic nature of peace for Afghans to decide what they want to see is the most important, because obviously what we did didn't work. So I'm going to end it there. This is the picture is us when we arrived in France, and we didn't have, we were still treated, processed as refugees when we were evacuated by the French authorities. And the only thing that we had was our plastic wristbands. And so we all, we took that picture to remind ourselves. And I still have my band with me always to remind myself how quickly a nation can disintegrate and how we can all find ourselves in the situation of in which Afghans find themselves today. And of course, now we understand it in Europe. So I'm going to end it there.
Thanks a lot. I think that was very interesting and also very appealing also that you shared so much of your personal experiences, and I think this is also always very important. Before I give the floor already to you, I would have a question on my own concerning the European Union. I mean, you mentioned it a little bit when it comes to humanitarian assistance, but what do you think, what could the European Union do, I mean, now at this point? I mean, does it have at all any capability to support anything what is going on within Afghanistan when it comes to like basic human rights? I think we're not talking about the European values as we are having it in the sense of democracy, minority rights, etc. But when it comes to very, very basic situation, like for example, humanitarian aid in exchange for having like at least basic education for women and girls, and probably like fighting against the burqa, I mean the obligatory burqa, for example. That would be my first question, and I would also already like to add another one. It is about the neighboring countries. I mean, we know that probably Pakistan played quite a huge role. I mean, also in the sense of who was financing the Taliban. I mean, there has always been this allegation that partly it was financed by Pakistan, and of course the neighboring countries like Pakistan, Iran, Turkmenistan, probably with the exception of Tajikistan for different reasons, they do have an interest that the Taliban stay more or less, that they consolidate because of their own security interests, and maybe also in the future for economic cooperation. So how do you see also the relation towards the neighboring countries, and what could the European Union do more to foster this idea of peace within the country, maybe in exchange for humanitarian aid or whatever possibilities you see?
Thank you so much. So for me, the European Union has a really important role to play because, as was mentioned at the opening of this event, the US now is seen as the empire that promised a lot and that at the end let the country down. And so this is not felt within Afghanistan towards the European Union. I think that the Taliban are really still seeking this international recognition in the same way that, you know, if you think about Turkey, way back when in the 70s wanted to, you know, join the European Union, and then the door was shut, and now we see what happened and how, you know, it started isolating itself more and more over time. And I think that the same mistake must not be repeated with Afghanistan today. There is a leverage that exists, humanitarian aid, and not just humanitarian aid, but also financial, an end of certain financial restrictions can be leveraged in political talks with the Taliban. And this is something that the European Union has been doing very recently, keeping almost shedding a projector onto some of the human rights violations and also recent political decisions of the Taliban against women, shedding a light on them and really having placing it at the center of their negotiations. And as long as in conflict resolution we talk about autistic hostility, when you stop talking, this is really when things escalate terribly, because then there's no possibility to come to any agreement, of course, if you stop talking. And I think that as long as this door is open, and Qatar, of course, is a really important place for this to take place and to physically occur. As long as this is happening, again, the Taliban need to feel that they still have something to gain, The day they realize or they are made to think that this game is over is really the day the lives of Afghans is going to become much more complicated. So that's one. And with regards to neighboring countries, it's true, again, going back to social media, I forgot, it was Sanction Pakistan. It was the hashtag that was the most used in Afghanistan right before August 15th, in the weeks prior to August 15th. And so it was widely believed within Afghanistan that Pakistan was behind the rapid progression of the Taliban. Of course, for many years, Pakistan has been a safe haven for the Taliban leadership. At the same time, it was always an ambiguous relationship, and it was never as clear. There has been reports of Pakistani Air Force helping the Taliban in the Panjshir province against the National Revolutionary Front of Ahmad Massoud, the son of Ahmed Shah Massoud. So, you know, Pakistan is definitely a party to the conflict, but at the same time, now with the political changes that have occurred there recently, I think that it has distanced itself a lot more, and the Taliban also have distanced themselves because they got their country back and they needed less and less to please Pakistan. It's true that other neighboring countries have a vested interest in Taliban in Afghanistan being relatively stable. At the same time, there's a strong Tajik minority in Afghanistan. The rear base of Ahmad Massoud is Tajikistan. All the helicopters left to Tajikistan on the Afghan Air Force helicopters left to Tajikistan on August 15th. So it's I think that much of what is going to happen diplomatically within the region is also going to be decided by economic interests. And as we know, China, and as I mentioned earlier, China is definitely a major player within that region. But so far, there has been no obvious support for the revolutionary forces of Afghanistan to retake the country from neighboring countries.
Any question from the audience right now?
In the 20 years of overwhelming international expertise, were there any efforts to have decentralized peace and conflict education? And what happened to those efforts?
Right. So first of all, expertise, of course, is a big word because not really. If we had been, we wouldn't be where we are today. For decentralizing peace efforts, they were peace education. Not that I know of. I know that, for instance, in Iraq, since 2003, there has been, now it's part of the curriculum of every Iraqi university, not at all in Afghanistan. Education outside of the main cities was already quite limited. And so there has been a few peace networks specifically attached to women networks, but that were striving towards, let's say, educating certain minorities, but mostly on their rights and not necessarily about peace. So even when I got to Afghanistan in 2019, peace was already was a very contentious word because it was in people's heads. It was, holding an election while bombing people or raiding them with the NATO airplanes. So that's I think that from the start, peace being associated to liberal peace meant that it was completely obliterated from the public discourse.
Hi, thank you very much. I have two questions, I think, about the university itself. The first one would be if you could maybe name, I'm curious how many Afghan citizens worked at the university, especially as a teaching staff. And the second question would be if you can, like looking back at all these years that you worked there or the university has been there, what would you say was the biggest success and the biggest failure of the university?
Okay, so in terms of teaching staff, we had many adjunct faculty members, so difference between full-time and adjuncts. The majority of adjuncts were and still are Afghan. And in terms of full-time faculty, I think we are at about 25% only right now of Afghan faculty members because of accreditation issues. It's important to have faculty with terminal degrees, i.e. with a doctorate, and because of the difficulties of attaining a doctorate in Afghanistan and having to move outside, of course, it was difficult for our Afghan contingent to actually have those terminal degrees. But I'm working to change that. And just today I was at having a meeting at CEU here, and we are trying to find opportunities for our Afghan adjunct faculty members to get those degrees. So my plan is within the next academic year to get to a 50-50 ratio, and probably by the time I leave, I want my successor to be an Afghan, and I would like the percentage to be 70-30. So that's the aim, because it is AUAF is an Afghan institution. Our biggest success is our student body, and our biggest failure, I think, is that they didn't feel hopeful or inspired or connected enough to stay in Afghanistan. But I cannot blame them. I left as well.
Thank you so much for your elaborations, Victoria. I would be very interested to hear a bit more about the potential role that you would see for science diplomacy in Afghanistan, particularly considering this need to establish a certain dialogue with the de facto government on certain levels that at least many stakeholders are identifying. And I'm wondering about your university, but I'm also wondering about other higher education institutions. I'm thinking about the University of Kabul, for example. And you were talking about the many Afghanistans before, and I'm wondering, doesn't that in a way also apply to the academic community as well? And I'm wondering about the interrelationship with other also public higher education institutions, and what potential role you would see for higher education in dialogue.
Okay, so it's extremely difficult. I'll give you one example. During what we call the peace talks, which was really a withdrawal agreement for the Americans, there was, so as you know, the American government decided to hold talks directly with the Taliban without involving the Afghan government. And they had their reasons, because President Ghani once again was like headstrong against it, and bombing the hell out of the Taliban areas. I mean, it was. I don't blame the Americans for sidelining the government when the government says, hell no to all peace attempts. Of course, but so when those talks occurred, we held many public fora like this, or lectures with different interlocutors from the negotiation team. So from the Afghan state, Afghan civil society, some of the negotiators. We had Fozia Kufi. We had many important. We even had Ambassador Khalilzad coming to the embassy, and our students being taken to him for him to sell the peace process to them, etc. So but we were never able to invite the Taliban on campus. And I remember I actually asked one of our interlocutors at the embassy once, I said, hey, you know, we're a university, we're supposed to open our doors, even though we are a prison, you know, to open our doors to everyone. And the closest we got was Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And it was already extremely tense within campus, and he was not even a Taliban. He was actually our next door neighbor, and he came in as a presidential candidate. But all this to say that within that, higher education was already extremely fragmented by the time, you know, during those 20 years. And that I think that the fact that there was no dialogue was the problem from the start. So when I say, you know, should we keep talking? No, it's like, should we even start talking? I believe so. And I believe that higher education is one of the most important forum for, you know, for those talks to occur and those dialogues to be fostered. The problem right now is that I think it was 5 or 6 days ago, the current Minister of Higher Education said that all the faculty that was recruited in public institutions in the last 20 years was no good and needed to be replaced by quote-unquote jihadis. So if the ministry itself is closing the doors towards dialogue, it's going to be important for us as a higher education institution outside of Afghanistan, and maybe as a network of institutions, to keep this dialogue open. For us right now, as I mentioned, it's no longer forbidden to speak to the Taliban. However, I think, you know, this could happen at the board level. I don't even know if it's happening at my level, at you know, within my institution. And I think that the space should be there. As a peace studies scholar, I mean, I would do that in a heartbeat. You know, if they tell me to go back to Kabul tomorrow, I will go back without even without worrying about anything, because this is my role. But which university right now still in Afghanistan will be able to do that? I am not sure. It's like it's no longer different Afghanistans. It's almost different planets.
There is a question, a very good one on Facebook. Mr. Haimon Lam, if I'm saying it right, asks, do you envisage the Taliban striking a compromise by adopting more liberal governance to facilitate the unfreezing of foreign treasury funds, or will they continue to increasingly pivot to China and Pakistan for investments and retain the conservative semi-Takfiri ideology? And then, relatedly, are there modernists within the Taliban that could either increase dissent within the administration, or are they rather homogeneous in their ideas of governance?
Okay. Thank you so much, because I forgot to talk about it, and that's important. So there is a strong, there are a lot of discrepancies between the rank of the Taliban and their political leadership. And this is a question that was asked, I think, to Sohail Shaheen recently, the spokesperson of the Taliban. You know, are your daughters going to school? And he said yes. And so it was like, but wait a second, you know. Many of the children of the Taliban elite who negotiated the Doha Agreement have their, many of those children are educated in universities outside of Afghanistan. When the Hekmatyar team came to AUAF, one of their many of the aides of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar said, "Oh, my son is at American University of Sharjah. My son is American University of the Gulf, etc. My daughter is, etc." So there is that sense that and that kind of discrepancy that is starting to emerge between the rank and file and the elite. At the same time, the elite is often using the rank and file to basically to change some of the narrative that they had politically advanced during the negotiations and earlier in August or September. So, it's really easy to have a good cop, bad cop scenario, and I'm not, part of those internal talks. But I think that sometimes it's too easy to say, oh, we cannot do this for political reason. Governing is also about making tough decisions, and I think that the Taliban leadership could be making or could be walking its talk in a much better way than just say, oh, I need to keep the support of my political base.
So, is it working? Yeah. I mean, I said at the very beginning, this is a very complicated situation, and I'm going to ask you a very complicated question. One could, of course, argue, and I'm sure you hear this from many sides, that where has all this effort, all this money to do dialogue, to teach, work on peace in Afghanistan, what has it led to? Some will answer absolutely nothing. But of course there is, I suppose, nuances to this question. So where do you situate this from? Was all these efforts simply done wrong? Or, as you also put it in your, as you also put the question in your presentation, are we simply dealing with irreconcilable worlds or world views? Interestingly, sort of while I framed these questions in my mind, I realized this is very similar questions you could ask yourselves in the current situation towards Russia, just as a side comment.
Okay, so were things done wrong? Definitely. You cannot talk about democracy while you keep killing people and making civilian victims. It's not possible. At the same time, at our level, when I see our students still within and outside of Afghanistan, I know that we did something right, because they are really the stars of this show. I'll give you one example. I've got so many, but one of them, Pashatana Durrani. She's from Kandahar. Her dad died during COVID. She became the head of the family almost overnight. She established her. She still is a student of political science and public administration. She established her own NGO. It's called Learn Afghanistan. During COVID, she was just teaching girls online in Kandahar. Now they are teaching girls in underground schools, and at the same time they are delivering humanitarian assistance all over the country. She left Afghanistan. She's now studying at Wellesley College for Women in the US. She met George and Laura Bush recently. She thanked them for their support to AUAF, liberal peace support. And Laura Bush's eyes lit up when she heard about AUAF. So it's all very complex, as you say. At the same time, if our students are changing the lives of their community on a daily basis, even thousands of kilometers away, I think that we did something right, and we'll keep doing it.
slowly coming to an end still, but I still do have, I prepared a lot of questions. I'm not going through them all, but I do have one question about diaspora. I mean, there's a huge Afghan diaspora, I mean, especially also in Austria, but all over the world. I mean, do they have any role when it comes to peace building within Afghanistan? That would be my first. And the second question is, about the fear of many Europeans or the so-called West of a spillover effect of more radical ideas. I mean, the Taliban, contrary to IS or ISIS or Daesh, never really appeared to have an idea of also spreading their ideology outside of Afghanistan. But do you think that this is a topic at all?
Okay, and the first question was?
The diaspora.
Diaspora, yeah. So the diaspora is complex, but I would say is still, you know, we talked about the many different Afghanistans and the fact that there was no common national sense. It's the same within the diaspora. So you'll find the Afghan Hazara, the Afghan Tajiks, the Afghan this and that, and eventually, I mean, now you can see it on Twitter how they are trying to, you know, kill one another with words. And again, I'm overgeneralizing, but the level of the verbal violence is intense. And I would say that, you know, the same problem that occurred within Afghanistan and that resulted in the fall of the government are replicated within the diaspora that is not united enough. At the same time, I'm sorry, I keep going back to this, but we have a very active board and they are all in agreement and working together. So when the diaspora puts its efforts together, they can really achieve amazing things. And I'm just hoping that it replicates in other parts of the Afghan diaspora. Now, to the ideas of the Taliban, I wouldn't say are about expansion of a so-called ideology, but at the same time, during the withdrawal talks that took place in Doha, very often, whenever there was a contentious point that was being negotiated, and whenever the Taliban needed leverage over the government, there would be an Islamic State attack overnight. So I can say this, you know, pretty clearly. I know that the Taliban have leveraged the Islamic State at times, and so the frontiers, borders are porous within those groups. If you go back to the last August situation, the Taliban made an announcement on the Wednesday that there shouldn't be that, you know, people shouldn't leave Afghanistan and that the brains shouldn't leave Afghanistan, and over you know, the next day there was the attack at the airport. Who was in charge of the airport security? It was the Haqqani network, which is very close to the Islamic State. So I would say that, you know, they have common interests very often, and I think that ideologically speaking, there is the threat is there. Political Islam is a cancer that can come within every society, that has pockets in Europe, and that is, you know, that has been destroying Afghanistan for the past 40 years. I go back to the picture of this miniature that I showed. This is not the culture of Afghanistan. It comes from Saudi Arabia, and I would say that it's not the Taliban ideology that's a problem. It's this mixing of religion and politics, and as long as it continues to plague the Islamic world, it will come to plague us as well. And we're all in this together because Afghans are suffering daily from this.
Thanks a lot for elaborating on that, because we do not want to come into a situation again when we say we did not see it coming. So we need to be open-eyed and watch all developments within and surrounding Afghanistan. Since we're already reaching our time, I think it was very interesting, but I would like you to end maybe on a positive note, because we were talking a little bit about hope, and I think especially these times we do need it as well. So I would ask you for a wish for the future. If you would have a wish for the future, let's say the next 10 years in Afghanistan, for Afghanistan, what would it be in a nutshell, very briefly?
Okay, well, if you tell me, today I just want electricity to keep teaching online, so that's it. Electricity, funding, and for, for us to keep our connection within Afghanistan, for Afghanistan not to close its doors, its shutters to the rest of the world. So my wish is for the youth to continue to feel that they can develop themselves, they can work for their country, they can work for their own education, and for them to keep their hope. That's what I want to see, and I want to see them thrive for the next 10 years. I want to see them, shape their country.
Thanks a lot for your very interesting insights. I learned a lot. I'm not an expert on Afghanistan, even though we should consider it as a very important country still, and it will come back to us, and it always did in the last 40 years. So I really appreciate that you found your time to travel to Vienna to discuss it with us. Thanks a lot to our cooperation partner, ASPR, the Austrian Study Centre for Peace and Conflict Resolution. I'm very happy that I also managed to say the whole name because it's quite long. And thanks you for coming, and we will still invite you for a glass of wine or water outside if you still have a question or want to chat a little bit, so outside. We recorded the event. We are going to put it online as well. I will surely will distribute it, and thanks for coming. Thanks for your insights, and have a pleasant evening. Goodbye.
Thank you.